me! James!
Please, stop! Hold him still. It's time to face the consequences.
But that brutal scene was just the ending. The real story, the one that led to this moment of horror, began months earlier. Let's go back to where it all started. Let's go back to the moment James O'Sullivan first walked through the gates of the Mayfair mansion, and Margaret Sinclair-Hayes' life changed forever. In London's most exclusive neighborhood, a beautiful garden would become the stage for a love story that ended in murder. When 38-year-old Margaret Sinclair-Hayes first saw the new gardener her husband hired, she didn't realize that forbidden love was about to destroy everything. In the heart of Mayfair, behind 15-foot stone walls and wrought iron gates, secrets would unfold that would shock London's elite. But let's go back to where it all began. In 2024, when Thomas Sinclair-Hayes, a 64-year-old shipping magnate, hired a new head gardener, his wife Margaret was about to discover that paradise was about to crumble. Margaret lived in a palace. The Victoria Mansion in Mayfair, worth £45 million, featured 18 rooms, a private ballroom, and most importantly, 7 acres of manicured gardens designed by a famous landscape architect in 1912. The gardens were Margaret's escape, a place where she could walk alone with her thoughts, away from the cold formality of her marriage to Thomas. Thomas Sinclair-Hayes was 64 years old and had built his fortune in international shipping. He controlled container ports from Singapore to Rotterdam, and his wealth was measured not just in millions, but in political influence. Prime ministers returned his phone calls. His business dinners shaped trade policy across 3 continents. At 38, Margaret was his third wife, a former art historian from Edinburgh who had married Thomas hoping to find companionship instead of just luxury. But their marriage was a masterpiece of loneliness disguised as privilege. Thomas spent most of his time at his office in Canary Wharf or traveling to business meetings across Europe. When he was home, he was distant, treating Margaret more like a curator treats a painting in a museum, something beautiful to display but never truly touch. They hadn't shared a bedroom in 3 years. They hadn't had a real conversation in longer than that. Margaret had lost herself. She had given up her career as a museum curator, abandoned her friends, and settled into a life of charity events and lonely walks through their magnificent gardens. She was 38, but felt 60, trapped in a marriage that was becoming increasingly cold and controlled. That's when James arrived. James O'Sullivan was 28 years old, the son of an Irish gardener who worked the grounds of country estates. He had trained at the Royal Horticultural Society and had a gift for bringing gardens to life. He was tall with suntanned skin, dark curly hair, and warm brown eyes that actually looked at people when they spoke. When Thomas hired him as head gardener after his previous gardener retired, Margaret felt something awakening inside her that had been dormant for years. Unlike the household staff who were formal and distant, James treated Margaret like a real person. He would ask her opinions about which flowers should go, where, discuss the history of the garden, and listen to her ideas with genuine interest. He noticed when she seemed sad and would leave fresh flowers on the terrace table for her to find. Small gestures that meant everything to someone as lonely as Margaret. At first, their relationship was purely professional. James would work in the gardens while Margaret occasionally came out to see his progress. But gradually, they began to talk more. Margaret learned that James was studying landscape design through evening courses, working toward credentials that would let him start his own garden design company someday. He spoke passionately about creating gardens that told stories, that connected people to nature and to each other. For his part, James saw through Margaret's perfect facade. He noticed how her face lit up when she smiled genuinely, how she would sit alone on the garden bench and stare into nothing for hours. He began to understand that all the wealth in the world meant nothing when you were suffocating in your own home. He started working early in the mornings so he could see her, started staying late into the evenings, creating excuses to be near her. Their friendship deepened during the summer when Thomas was away on a month-long business trip to Asia. Margaret found herself looking forward to James's arrival each morning, disappointed when he left each evening. She began asking him to work later, to help her plan new sections of the garden, to have tea with her while they discussed design ideas. One afternoon in July, as they walked through the rose garden at sunset, James stopped and turned to face Margaret. "Mrs. Sinclair-Hayes, he began, but she interrupted him. "Please, just call me Margaret." That night, as the sun painted the sky orange and pink, James kissed her beneath an ancient oak tree in the center of the garden. Margaret felt more alive in that moment than she had felt in years. Their affair became their sanctuary. They would meet in the garden cottage where James kept his tools, hidden from view by thick hedges and flowering vines. They made love on worn cushions surrounded by the smell of earth and growing things. Margaret, for the first time in her marriage, felt truly seen and desired. James, for the first time in his life, experienced love with someone who genuinely cared about him beyond what he could do for her. But their secret was becoming impossible to keep. Margaret's behavior changed in ways that couldn't be hidden. She became happier, more energetic, and spent increasing amounts of time in the garden. The household staff began to notice. "Madam seems different lately," the cook mentioned to the head housekeeper. "She's always smiling now, always asking if we've seen the gardener." Margaret's joy reached the ears of Robert, Thomas's personal security chief. Robert was former Scotland Yard, hired specifically to protect Thomas's business interests and monitor his household. He began paying closer attention to Margaret's movements, noting the extended time she spent in the garden with James, the way she lit up when she saw him arriving each morning. Meanwhile, Thomas noticed changes in his wife that made him deeply uncomfortable. Margaret seemed distracted during business dinners, showed little interest in the charity galas they attended together, and appeared to be avoiding him. "You seem different lately," he told her one evening. "More engaged somehow. Are you having an affair?" The accusation was casual, almost offhand, but his eyes were sharp that Margaret's heart nearly stopped. "Of course not," she managed to reply. "I've simply been enjoying the garden more. It's helped my depression." That night, Thomas called Robert. "I want a full surveillance report on my wife's activities. I suspect she may be having an inappropriate relationship with one of the staff." Robert had been waiting for this conversation. "I've already noticed some irregularities, sir. Should I begin comprehensive monitoring?" "Do it," Thomas replied coldly. "And be thorough." Robert's investigation was meticulous. He reviewed security footage from the garden, discovered the key card access records showing Margaret entering the garden cottage at specific times, and interviewed staff members carefully. Within 2 weeks, he had photographic evidence of Margaret and James kissing beneath the oak tree, records of time they spent alone in the cottage, and enough documentation to prove the affair beyond any doubt. When Thomas returned from his latest business trip, Robert presented him with a file containing everything. Thomas read in complete silence, his face betraying no emotion, even as something dark and dangerous grew inside him. The humiliation was unbearable. Not just the adultery, but that his wife had chosen a gardener, a working-class Irish man with dirt under his fingernails. "What do you recommend?" Thomas asked Robert quietly. "In cases like this, there are several approaches. We could confront them, pursue legal action, or handle the matter more discreetly. I want them both to understand the consequences of their betrayal," Thomas said, his voice ice-cold. "But I also want to protect my reputation. Discretion is paramount." "Understood completely, sir," Robert replied. "I can make this disappear." As Robert left to begin planning, neither Margaret nor James knew their secret had been discovered. They were planning their escape. Margaret had been secretly moving money into accounts James didn't know about, planning to leave Thomas and start a new life together somewhere far from London. Margaret told Thomas she was attending a 3-day wellness retreat in Cotswolds. Instead, she and James were going to spend the weekend together at a small cottage by the seaside. Those 2 days were the happiest of both their lives. They walked on the beach, talked about their future, and for the first time, allowed themselves to imagine a life together. But Robert had used those 2 days to plan the perfect trap. When Margaret and James returned to the garden cottage on Sunday evening to collect some things before leaving, they found Robert and 2 of his associates waiting inside. The confrontation was swift and brutal. "Mrs. Sinclair-Hayes," Robert said calmly, Your husband would like to have a word with you both." The terror in Margaret's eyes was immediate. She grabbed James's hand, but Robert's men quickly separated them, forcing James to his knees while restraining Margaret. "Please," James begged. "This is between me and Mr. Sinclair-Hayes. Let her go." "You've both made your choices," Robert replied coldly. "Now you'll face the consequences." What happened next was never fully documented in the official reports. The violence lasted for hours. Margaret's screams echoed through the garden. James fought desperately to protect her, trying again and again to break free from the men holding him. But Robert was methodical, professional, and utterly without mercy. James made one final attempt to protect Margaret with a hidden phone he always carried, a safety measure after he began to suspect they were being watched. The phone fell beneath a shelf during the struggle, continuing to record as everything descended into chaos. "If something happens to us," James's voice would later tell investigators, "Thomas Sinclair-Hayes arranged this. Robert Blackwell is his security chief. They've been following us for weeks. We were just trying to be happy. We weren't hurting anyone." When it was over, Robert called Thomas to report that the problem had been resolved. The bodies were disposed of in the Thames, weighted down, and dropped from a private pier at midnight. The garden cottage was thoroughly cleaned, all evidence erased. But Robert had made one critical mistake. He hadn't found James's phone. 3 days later, when neither Margaret nor James appeared, the first warning sounded. James's mother called the police to report her son missing. When Margaret's sister contacted the authorities about her missing sister, the investigation began to spiral beyond Thomas's control. Scotland Yard discovered James's phone, still miraculously intact, recovered from the Thames by a fisherman who noticed something shiny in his nets. The audio recordings on that phone would change everything. The investigation that followed would expose not just a double murder, but a conspiracy of wealth, power, and the belief that some people are truly above the law. Thomas Sinclair-Hayes, the respected shipping magnate with connections throughout government and commerce, would discover that in Britain, justice applies to everyone, regardless of their fortune or influence. The trial that followed in November 2024 would captivate the nation. The prosecution would paint a picture of a man so consumed with possessiveness and wounded pride that he ordered the execution of his own wife rather than face the humiliation of divorce. Robert Blackwell would testify that Thomas had given explicit instructions to make the lovers disappear permanently. "He told me that his honor was worth more than their lives," Robert testified. He said that a working man touching his wife was an insult that could only be washed away with blood. He wanted them both dead, but he wanted it to look like they had simply run away together. The evidence was overwhelming. Phone records, financial transactions, security footage, forensic evidence, and most damning of all, James's final recording capturing the moments before the murders. On December 18, 2024, Thomas Sinclair-Hayes was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 40 years. Robert Blackwell received life with a 35-year minimum. The judge's sentencing remarks were scathing. "You believed your wealth gave you dominion over life and death. You treated your wife as property and her lover as disposable." The court sends a clear message. In Britain, no one is above the law. The mansion in Mayfair was seized and sold. The 7 acres of beautiful gardens that had been Margaret and James's sanctuary were torn out and replanted, unable to bear the weight of what had happened there. Margaret's sister established a foundation supporting women escaping controlling relationships. James's mother created a scholarship fund for working-class students pursuing horticultural education. The garden cottage was demolished. The oak tree where they had shared their first kiss was cut down, but not before locals left flowers and candles there for months, a quiet memorial to 2 people whose only crime was loving each other. In the end, 3 lives were destroyed by one man's obsession with control and the belief that wealth could buy him immunity from justice. But their deaths were not in vain. They proved that even in the most exclusive neighborhoods, behind the highest walls, justice would eventually find those who believed themselves beyond its reach. The secrets of Mayfair's gardens had finally been exposed, and the price of that exposure was paid in blood.